How many times have you tried counting calories and gotten nowhere? Here's the problem. Calories aren't actually a signal your body understands. You don't have calorie receptors. Real fullness, true satiety, comes from two completely different signals, fat and protein. These are the nutrients your body actually tracks. Neglect either one, and you'll keep overeating no matter how hard you try to control portions. Hi everyone. Today I want to break down how protein specifically helps drive weight loss. The two real satiety signals. There are two signals your body uses to determine fullness and satisfaction. The first is protein. It's an essential nutrient, meaning your body absolutely requires it and can't make it from scratch. Your body actually monitors how much protein you're taking in and checks whether it's enough, because protein is the raw material for hormones, immune cells, tissue repair, and building new tissue. The second is fat. We need fat for energy. It's actually our best, most stable energy source. Some fats are essential too, omega-3s, omega-6s, and the fatty acids that get built into cell membranes, but that's a separate topic. Here we're talking about fat used as fuel. Used this way, fat triggers its own satiety response, completely independent from the one triggered by protein. We'll get into exactly how both of these work. Fat gives us steady, stable energy. Carbohydrates, by contrast, do neither of these jobs. They're not a satiety signal, they're not essential, and they're not a great energy source. When you eat a lot of carbs and train your body to depend on them, you end up hungry no matter how much you eat. That's exactly why protein functions as a satiety signal, and why the message from your body is simple. You need protein. Eating a lot of calories on its own won't stop you from eating. Your body isn't counting calories, it genuinely doesn't track them. You'll keep eating until your protein needs are met. Once your protein intake is sufficient, you stop. This whole process is regulated by a range of hormones: ghrelin, the hunger hormone, PYY, and of course GLP-1, the glucagon-like peptide 1 that's gotten so much attention lately because it's the basis of an expensive, controversial class of drugs. A word on GLP-1 drugs. When someone takes a GLP-1 agonist like semaglutide, just one brand among several, the drug artificially spikes GLP-1 production. The body is essentially tricked into thinking it has eaten. GLP-1 goes up and mimics satiety, but nothing has actually been consumed. That's genuinely risky, because if you override your natural hunger signals, you can end up with real nutrient deficiencies. Those signals exist for a reason. Your body needs protein, other nutrients, essential fatty acids, and so on. Ignore them long enough, and your body loses track of when it actually needs to eat. Rather than using a synthetic drug to artificially trigger and disrupt your system, it's better to give your body what it actually needs and let it respond to its own real signals. That's how you keep it genuinely healthy. How much protein are you actually using every day? Most people have no idea how much protein their body synthesizes, uses, and redistributes daily. We use roughly 300–400 grams of protein per day just to repair and build tissue. New tissue is constantly being produced, but most of that protein, about 3/4 of it, is recycled. Tissues break down, cells have a lifespan, muscle fibers wear out, and the body recovers and reuses that protein wherever it can. Then there are what's called obligatory losses, protein that simply can't be recovered, around 20.25 grams a day, lost through urine. Skin sheds, hair and gut lining are constantly regenerating, and all of that carries protein away permanently. Most people eat somewhere around 70 to 100 grams of protein a day, which is enough to offset these obligatory losses and maintain a kind of equilibrium. But it's not enough to fuel extra repair or build new tissue. And here's the interesting part for this conversation. 70,100 grams isn't enough to actually shut off the hunger signals we just talked about. Your body still doesn't feel satisfied. How much protein do you actually need?
As mentioned,
The 70,100 grams most people eat isn't even enough to fully block those hunger signals. A lot of people think, I eat burgers, that's meat, that's good protein, I'm covered. But if you ate 3 Big Macs a day, obviously an extreme example just to illustrate the point, you're not getting nearly as much protein as you'd think, because it's diluted protein, lots of processed ingredients, sugar, grains, and oil. 3 Big Mac meals a day only nets you about 75.90 grams of protein, while delivering 3,300, 3,600 calories, far more than the roughly 2,000 calories we're usually working from, for an average-sized person needing 70,100 grams of protein. Someone larger needs proportionally more. So burgers, even though people count them as meat, aren't really an efficient solution. For most people, a realistic target is around 1.2, 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, which works out to roughly 90,100 grams for someone around 75 kilograms, 165 pounds. Scale that up if you're heavier. It's worth understanding that this range is really about repair and muscle building, not just maintenance. The 70 to 100 gram range keeps you stable. The 90 to 120 gram range gives you a meaningful surplus to work with. Some people should aim even higher, around 1.6, 2.2 grams per kilogram, or roughly 120, 165 grams a day for that same 75 kilogram person. You might want to push toward this higher end if you're older, since anabolic hormone production disclosure declines with age, protein digestion and absorption become less efficient, and stomach acid production, needed to break down protein properly, tends to drop. As you age, lose muscle mass, and see growth hormone levels plateau, prioritizing muscle support becomes more important. Fat, the second signal. Even though this is fundamentally a protein-focused conversation about hunger signals and fat loss, fat deserves its own spotlight because it's the second key signal. Fat slows gastric emptying, it makes food leave your stomach more slowly, and it stimulates a hormone called CCK, cholecystokinin, which does 2 things. It triggers the gallbladder to release bile for digestion, and it acts as a fast, strong satiety signal, completely separate from the one triggered by protein. The smartest strategy is to eat protein and fat together. Naturally fatty protein sources, eggs, beef, ground beef, fatty fish, full-fat dairy, give you both signals at once, each reinforcing satiety independently. Carbohydrates, on the other hand, trigger neither signal. Instead, they behave more like a substance that drives cravings and increased hunger, while spiking blood sugar and insulin. The science of mTOR and muscle protein synthesis. Here's a slightly more technical section, but I'll keep it simple and go slowly, because understanding how protein actually works matters. An amino acid in protein called leucine typically makes up about 10% of protein's composition. When you consume enough leucine, you activate a pathway called mTOR, mechanistic mammalian target of rapamycin, essentially a muscle-building switch. Consuming roughly 2.53 grams of leucine, which corresponds to about 25-30 grams of protein, is what triggers this mTOR activation. Picture a response curve. On one axis, mTOR activation. On the other, grams of protein consumed, 10, 20, 30, 40 grams. The curve starts low, rises sharply, then plateaus. Activation ramps up quickly and essentially maxes out somewhere between 25 and 30 grams of protein. Go lower, say 20 grams, and you still get some effect, some muscle-building signal, just meaningfully weaker. The best cost-benefit point sits around 25-30 grams. Push up to 40 grams, and you can still use some of it, but the additional mTOR activation is minimal. Bodybuilders pay close attention to this because they're optimizing muscle repair, growth, and development. But even for people who aren't athletic or particularly active, eating at least 25-30 grams of protein per meal activates mTOR, and supports tissue repair and muscle maintenance. How muscle sensitivity to protein works after training. If you're a bodybuilder trying to build muscle, the process starts with challenging the muscle, creating micro tears that signal your body to rebuild and grow stronger. Once that damage happens, your body becomes more sensitive to protein and to the mTOR pathway for the next 24-48 hours. The old advice was to train hard and then eat within 30 minutes. That's outdated, it doesn't work that precisely. This heightened sensitivity, this increased appetite your muscles have for protein, and greater tendency to actually use it for muscle building, persists for 24-48 hours after training. Here's the genuinely useful part. Once you eat enough protein to cross that 25-30 gram threshold and activate mTOR, the pathway stays active for roughly 3 to 5 hours before gradually tapering off, regardless of how intense your workout was or how much protein you ate beyond that threshold. Hitting the threshold is what matters. The duration afterward is fairly fixed. Practically, this means that if you eat 2 or 3 meals spaced a few hours apart, you trigger 2 or 3 separate windows of muscle repair and growth. If you eat only 1 meal a day, you only trigger 1 such window. This is where things get nuanced, and I know this touches on a topic I've discussed a lot. How many meals a day is actually optimal? Let's dig into that properly. Muscle building versus metabolic health, a trade-off to consider. One important thing to weigh, depending on your priorities, is how much you value muscle gain versus reversing metabolic disease. You can pursue both, but you may want to lean toward one or the other, depending on where you are right now. Keep this in mind. If muscle gain is your priority, you need to actually train. You need to stress your muscles to sensitize them and make the most of that mTOR window. What happens with too much protein? Let's talk about protein excess. Protein's main job isn't providing energy, it's repairing and building tissue. If you eat more protein than your body can use in a single sitting, the surplus gets converted into glucose and used as energy instead. So what counts as too much? The 25-30 grams we discussed is the starting threshold for a solid mTOR response. But your body can keep using more than that up to a point, generally referred to as a ceiling, somewhere between 40 and 70 grams per meal. That's roughly the maximum your body can put to use in one sitting before the rest gets converted to energy. Where you fall in that 40-70 gram range depends on your body size, muscle mass, and activity level. The bigger and more active you are, the closer to 70 grams your ceiling tends to be. Why does this ceiling exist? Why can't your body just use 150 grams in one meal if you ate that much? The short answer, no, that wouldn't help. Your circulating pool of amino acids and protein is small and tightly regulated. Compare that to fat. We store plenty of it as a long-term energy reserve and can rely on it for months. Carbohydrates we can use to some degree, but really only about a day's worth at a time. Protein is even more tightly controlled because blood amino acid levels need to stay within a fairly narrow range. Once you've used about 70 grams from a meal, anything beyond that gets converted into glucose. Gluconeogenesis, where excess protein goes. This conversion process is called gluconeogenesis, literally making new glucose from things that weren't originally glucose. There are 3 main ways this happens. 1. Excess dietary protein, as we just discussed, being converted to glucose. 2. A constant baseline process. The body is always producing some glucose between meals, primarily by breaking down glycogen, your stored carbohydrate reserve. 3. From glycerol, a byproduct of breaking down stored fat, triglycerides. Triglycerides are made of 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol backbone, and that small glycerol piece can be converted into glucose. Glycogen and glycerol are the 2 main sources your body relies on to maintain steady blood sugar. Since a continuous glucose supply is essential, and your body is very efficient at generating it, from glycogen for as long as supplies last, and from glycerol almost indefinitely, for months if needed. But remember, Protein's core job is tissue building, and your body generally wants to preserve muscle protein rather than burn it for fuel. The body prioritizes glycogen and glycerol first, and only in extreme starvation or prolonged fasting does it start breaking down actual body protein for glucose. The exception is excess dietary protein. Since we can't store it and can only put roughly 40–70 grams to use per sitting, anything beyond that gets converted to glucose, not unlike how excess blood sugar gets converted to fat via insulin. This happens because a buildup of circulating amino acids is actually toxic. It produces ammonia, which is harmful to the body. That's part of why this whole system is so tightly regulated. The body simply can't let unused amino acids accumulate. Protein, ketosis, and fasting. I've made a lot of content on ketosis and ketogenic diets, cutting carbs low enough that the body shifts to burning fat and producing ketones as a byproduct, which then fuel the brain when glucose is low. Being in ketosis essentially signals that your body is burning more fat. Intermittent fasting is another route to the same state. So here's the question through a protein lens. If you eat excess protein and it gets converted to glucose via gluconeogenesis, can that glucose surplus be enough to knock you out of ketosis? Can eating enough protein essentially mimic the effect of eating a high-carb meal? The answer is yes, it's possible, especially if you're eating one large meal a day. The key difference from a high-carb meal is that this glucose conversion via gluconeogenesis is much slower and more gradual. It does create a glucose surplus and can interrupt ketosis, but it's nowhere near the sharp blood sugar and insulin spike that carbs cause directly. A practical example: 1 meal versus 2 versus 3. Say you're eating 1 meal a day and trying to maximize protein. You've calculated you need about 120 grams. So your plan is 1 meal, 120 grams of protein. The problem is, your body can't use more than about 70 grams of that in one sitting. Eat all 120 grams at once, and roughly 50 grams get diverted into gluconeogenesis and converted to glucose. Now imagine splitting that same 120 grams across 2 meals, 60 grams each. That's a much more manageable amount per sitting, and your body can likely use nearly all of it, with maybe 20 grams or so converted to glucose instead of 50. Split across 3 meals, you'd likely see little to no conversion at all. There's no meaningful excess to trigger gluconeogenesis in the first place. So the right protein amount and meal frequency for you really comes down to your priorities. Let's walk through a few scenarios. 3 meals a day. Your fasting window is probably around 14–16 hours, with meals spaced roughly 8–10 hours apart during the day and about 4 hours between each. Plenty of time for 3 distinct protein hits and 3 separate mTOR activation windows. This is the ideal setup if muscle building is your main goal, particularly if you train regularly. That said, it may make it somewhat harder to reverse insulin resistance as efficiently, not because your health suffers overall, but because you're not giving your body as much uninterrupted time between meals. And the interval between meals appears to be one of the most important factors in letting insulin levels drop and improving insulin sensitivity. 2 meals a day. This likely gives you a 16–18 hour fasting window, with meals spaced 6 to 8 hours apart. This tends to preserve and support muscle mass well, while still meaningfully improving insulin resistance, a genuinely balanced approach. 1 meal a day. This typically means around a 23-hour fasting window, assuming you eat that 1 meal within about an hour. I mentioned earlier that I have some reservations here around muscle preservation for 2 specific reasons. Even if you eat 120 grams of protein, your body can't use all of it. Roughly 50 grams gets converted to glucose via gluconeogenesis, meaning the real usable maximum from that meal is closer to 70 grams. And since you're only eating once, you only get a single mTOR activation window per day. 1 muscle-building opportunity instead of 2 or 3. On insulin resistance, there are 2 things worth weighing. You do get a substantial benefit from that 23-hour fasting window, but roughly 50 grams of your protein intake still converts to sugar. Not as disruptive as eating actual sugar, since it's a much slower process, but it can be enough to knock you out of ketosis and somewhat slow your progress reversing insulin resistance, given the glucose load involved. So one meal a day isn't necessarily a bad choice, but if you go this route, it's probably smarter to cap your protein intake around 70 grams for that meal. It may not be optimal for muscle building, but it supports better insulin resistance reversal. Just know that muscle-wise, you're only getting a single mTOR activation window. Putting it all together. If you're a bodybuilder or muscle gain is your top priority, aim for 3 meals a day to get 3 separate mTOR activation windows, though keep in mind you likely won't see the full benefit without consistent training. For most people, 2 meals a day is probably the best balance. Solid muscle support alongside good insulin resistance management. If reversing insulin resistance and losing weight is your main goal, 1 meal a day is likely your best option. Just dial back your protein intake somewhat, since anything beyond what your body can use in that sitting won't be put to good use anyway. In practice, aim for your target protein range, somewhere between 1.2 and 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, a wide range but still well above standard official recommendations, and spread it across 1 to 3 meals, 2 being my general recommendation for most people. Practical eating tips. Prioritize whole, real foods. Choose protein sources that naturally come with fat attached. If they don't, add a small amount of healthy fat alongside them. Include leafy greens and non-starchy vegetables, low in carbs, great for gut health. Structure your meals to start with protein and fat first. A few bites or a starter salad can help slow digestion. If you're planning to eat carbs, eat them a bit later in the meal, after protein and fat have already started triggering satiety and slowing digestion. Finally, if weight loss is your goal, remember this isn't a green light for unlimited high-protein, high-fat eating. Moderation still matters. Listen to your body and respond to what it genuinely needs. If you enjoyed this, you'll love the next one. And if you're serious about taking control of your health by understanding how your body actually works, subscribe, turn on notifications, and make sure you never miss an essential video.